On paper, Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel is an absolutely fantastic simulator for a trading card game. It looks great, it plays great, and there's a lot to be excited about. We have the normal and rare Rarity Festival coming up. We have possibly some big updates coming on April 3rd, just judging by when a lot of the things rotate out of the shop, and the Duel Pass ends that day as well. And we have some fun features like the live spectate feature that I've been doing a lot on my Twitch stream over the past week. But I think it's finally time to talk about Master Duel's biggest problem, and I really wanted to try and not make these types of videos anymore because I feel like Konami is trying to improve the game, but Master Duel fundamentally has a huge issue, and I'm not really sure what Konami is going to do to fix it. Yu-Gi-Oh! As a card game is really not meant to be played in a best of one format. Side decking is a huge part of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, and a lot of other trading card games use side decks as well. Just in case you guys don't know, when you enter a real-life Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG tournament, you not only have your main and extra deck, but you also have a 15-card side deck. Now, when you play against people in tournaments, you play in a best-of-3 match, and in between each game, you can swap cards out from your main deck and swap in cards from your side deck. And this matters because if you play against a combo deck, you can side into anti-combo cards like Drone Lockbird or Nibiru, or if you play against a back row deck, you could side into anti-back row cards like Lightning Storm or Evenly Matched. And this is a really good thing, by the way, because it means if you metagame properly and look up what the expected matchups are, you can side deck cards that are specifically for the popular decks. So, in theory, if a burn deck became super popular in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG format, you could side deck any number of anti-burn hand traps, and that would probably push down that burn deck's popularity because people suddenly started side decking for it. Now, of course, side decking does not fix every problem with Yu-Gi-Oh!'s metagame. Many decks can play through side deck cards, that's not really a secret. But there are a lot of decks, people might call them cheese decks, that don't really do that well in best 2 out of 3s. Exodia is a good example, burn decks are a good example. Many different weird FTKs in this game's history have not been that good at tournaments, specifically because they weren't good against side decked cards. However, in Master Duel, because there aren't side decks, a lot of those decks are now suddenly a lot better. Not to mention the OCG Ban List, which Master Duel is primarily based on, leaves a lot of cards unhit that make those decks a lot more consistent. Chicken Game is at 3, Upstart is at 3, Into the Void is at 3. These cards make cheesy decks a lot better than they would have been in the TCG, even ignoring the side deck problem. Of course, this problem has always been in Master Duel, but I really feel like over the past couple of weeks or so, it really has gotten to the point where Master Duel, at least in the higher ranks, is borderline unplayable if you get unlucky with your matchups. I really think if Konami cares about Master Duel's longevity, that they really have to hit a lot of cards specifically because the game is played in a best of one format. Also, I'm sure that a few people are going to say that because I've played decks like Nurse Burn and Altergeist in Master Duel that I can't complain about the format, but let's be real here. Altergeist is terrible in Master Duel, especially compared to the other control decks like True Draco and Eldritch, and when it comes to Nurse Burn, while that deck can be pretty consistent and pretty cheesy, it's a lot less consistent and way easier to interrupt than many of the other decks that I'll talk about in today's video. But sure, if it takes banning all of the Nurse Burn cards to also have Konami hit these decks that I'm about to talk about, by all means, I hope they do that. I really don't care about Nurse Burn that much. But let's talk about a deck that is basically a much better version of Nurse Burn, Banquet of Millions FTK. Well, not technically an FTK, I guess it gives you until your draw phase to respond, but realistically, this is one of the easiest decks to play that's incredibly powerful and basically wins every single time it goes first, not to mention there are almost no counters to it that are commonly played. How the Banquet of Millions FTK works is you activate a card called Banquet of Millions, obviously, which banishes a bunch of cards in your extra deck and your opponent's extra deck. Then you simply flip up 2 copies of DD Dynamite to burn your opponent out of the game on turn 1. Now that combo might sound kind of inconsistent, right? You need 2 copies of DD Dynamite and 1 copy of Banquet of Millions. And this deck really has not seen play in the TCG, definitely, but also I'm pretty sure it hasn't seen play in the OCG either as far as I know. But in Master Duel, because there isn't side decking and because pretty much all of the crazy draw spells are at 3 copies per deck, this is one of the most efficient ways to win in this game. This deck is super consistent, by the way, not only because of how many crazy draw spells are legal in Master Duel, but also because these two cards happen to be normal trap cards, which means you can use cards like Trap Trick and Lilith to get to them super often on turn 1. This deck is so easy to play, in fact, that apparently a few people out there have built bots to play it for them in the background. It really requires no skill to build this deck or to play this deck, more so than basically every other deck in the entire game. Yeah, people call decks like Eldritch skillless, but at least that deck requires you to think about your plays a little bit, where this deck really doesn't require any thinking at all. Now, there are counters to this combo that I want to talk about, but as I go through here, you'll notice why the deck is so good. So first off, the only counter that works 100% of the time is playing a deck that does not have any extra deck cards. By doing this, you cut them off of their Banquet of Millions, which effectively makes them lose the game. In fact, I've seen a lot of opponents that are playing that deck instantly scoop if they play against a deck that does not play any extra deck cards. Unfortunately, in all of the Yu-Gi-Oh decks out there's only a handful of them that can actually play without an extra deck, and there's only a handful of those ones that can actually be good against other matchups as well. I think that True Dracos and Monarchs and maybe Phantasm Spiral are pretty much the only 3 decks that you could realistically play without an extra deck that would also be good in other matchups. Another counter that I've seen a lot of people do, which I personally have started doing, is that you can play your normal deck but only play a 13 card extra deck. In that case, if your opponent has Banquet of Millions plus 2 copies of DD Dynamite and no other burn cards, they'll only do 7,800 damage, which does theoretically give you an opportunity to strike back. I want to make it clear that I think that this is the best general counter that you can do to beat this deck if you want to play a normal deck in Master Duel, but I will say here that it's not perfect. So one problem is that if your opponent has literally any other burn card, you will probably still lose because you'll only be at 200 life points. A lot of these decks play down 1000, which does 1000 damage to both players, and in that case you'll start your turn at 7000, not 8000, so by playing a 13 card extra deck, you'll still lose to the double DD Dynamite. The other problem with this counter is that you will have to win without an extra deck. You know, even though you might not have gotten OTK'd by the double DD Dynamite, you still won't have an extra deck for that turn, and a lot of decks can't really do much without their extra deck. So I don't think that this counter is perfect, and that's why I am putting it behind the just plain no extra deck, but it is still probably the easiest way to give yourself a chance in this matchup. There are 2 other counters that I wanted to mention. These are not nearly as consistent, but they are pretty good, or at least one of them is. So the better of the 2 would be playing 1 copy of Red Reboot in your main deck. If you happen to draw that card, you can very easily stop the entire combo and then OTK your opponent, because you won't actually get rid of your entire extra deck because you'll simply Red Reboot to the first trap that they use. The second one though is a little bit less good, but I guess you could try it out if you really are losing to this deck a lot. If you are already playing Crossout Designator in your deck, you could put in 1 copy of DD Dynamite to banish with your Designator. Is that really that good? Probably not, but I don't know. I played like 10 games last night and I lost to the Banquet deck 6 out of those 10 games on turn 1. I will mention there was one really funny instance that I posted about on Twitter where I lost to a Banquet deck, switched to a True Draco deck so I wouldn't lose to that, and then 2 games later I played against the same Banquet player and he had to scoop on turn 1 because I did not have an extra deck. And I realized to a lot of returning Yu-Gi-Oh players, there's no difference between the Banquet of Millions OTK deck and a regular tier 1 meta deck that sets up a bunch of negates. But against the meta decks, you have options, things like Maxi and Ash Blossom and Kaijus and Forbidden Droplet and Lightning Storm, and all of those cards except for Ash Blossom do nothing in this matchup. So unless you want to put a bunch of anti-burn hand traps in your deck that would only be good against Banquet of Millions and really bad in any other matchup, you are probably going to lose to this deck every single turn 1 unless you completely took out your entire extra deck. Even the 13 card extra deck thing, like I said, while it does help, it's not completely reliable because a lot of the times your opponent burns you with some other card as well. And it's kind of funny because about a month ago everyone was complaining about the Numeron deck, it seemed like, but that deck at least has some amount of counterplay. It's also way less consistent compared to this deck because it actually has to go second, which gives your opponent a chance to set up. By the way, just in case you guys didn't know, the Numeron OTK deck that you see in Master Duel was very unpopular in the TCG once again here because of side decking. That deck is very linear. It only really has like one play, so just a couple side deck cards can completely stop it in its tracks. Is that deck annoying in Master Duel? Absolutely. Should it probably be hit in some way on the next ban list? Yes, but it is way way worse in comparison to the Banquet of Millions OTK base deck, because at least the Numeron deck gives you a small chance. I'm not saying that Numeron is not unfair or unfun to play against, but it is a deck that is clearly worse than the Banquet deck, which I think is pretty obvious because a lot of players have jumped ship from that deck to Banquet of Millions OTK. I don't think that Master Duel is dying. I don't want to doom post, but this is a serious problem, and it kind of has overshadowed a lot of the other problems in Master Duel right now. There was a session that I played the other day, like I said, where I lost 6 games out of 10 to that Banquet deck on turn 1, and then I had to finally say, okay, I'm going to switch to True Draco just to have a chance. This deck is not everywhere. You know, I've had entire live streams where I haven't played against it a single time, but then on other days, like more than half of my matchups are against the Banquet of Millions OTK. I hope with the new like common and rare rarity festival event that those players maybe go do anything else with their time, but for now, at least for the foreseeable future, a lot of people are going to play this really cheesy OTK based deck, and there is very little that you can do about it. Let me know in the comment section below, what do you think Konami should do on the upcoming Master Duel ban list? I know that a lot of the countdowns are ending on April 3rd, so I hope we get a new ban list and a new card pool at that time, but I really do think that going forward, if Konami wants Master Duel to be a long-term game that people play, they are going to have to address cards that are way more toxic in a best of 1 format compared to a best of 3 format. Like I said, I know why the game has best of 1s instead of best of 3s, but the ban list needs to reflect that if Konami wants people to keep playing this game. Right now, unless everyone suddenly switches to True Dracos or Monarchs overnight, there's basically no reason to not play the Banquet deck if you are trying to grind to Plat 1, because even if you come across like a couple True Draco players or Monarch players along the way, realistically, most of the time you will win on turn 1 in about 2 minutes, if that. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you later. Goodbye.